Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. I'm just going to give a couple of minutes and then go ahead and get started. I see we're getting a lot of participants. All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Well, hello. Welcome to this Reuters webinar, Master Data Confidence to Level Up Your Real-World Evidence Strategy. And thank you for taking the time to be here with us. I'm Jana Mangelovskaya. I'm a lead researcher in the real-world evidence team at Veradigm. I'm joined today by a panel of experts from Chiesi, AbbVie, and Moderna, who will be introducing themselves shortly and sharing their insights and perspectives on this important topic. A couple of things I want to mention before we begin. We will be taking Q&A towards the end of the panel discussion, so I encourage you to submit your questions via the Q&A function. We'll do our best to get to as many of them as possible. This webinar will run live for 1 hour, and then the recording will be sent to the email address that you used to register. And finally, I'll briefly introduce Veradigm and why we've chosen to partner with this discussion topic. I'll make this quick. Right, you should see my screen. So Veradigm is uniquely positioned in the real-world evidence space for several reasons. We are the EHR originator for our EHR data. And this is important because we build, develop, and enhance the technology that sits between providers and patients. For my team specifically, which is the real-world evidence team that sits within the life sciences business unit, we leverage the data generated by these systems to provide insights. And this could be through retrospective studies, prospective studies, PRO collection, registries, and more. Our data are large. We hear that often nowadays, but you can see the Veradigm Network EHR database is large. It's a very large ambulatory EHR database. And the reason we picked this topic to speak on is that our team and our data are very well suited to support the entire biopharmaceutical product lifecycle, which is an overarching theme that you'll hear in today's discussion. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing and turn it over to our panelists to introduce themselves. Patricia, would you like to go first?
Sure. Thank you, Jana. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Patricia Dorley. I am the head for Health Economics and Outcomes Research and Real-World Evidence for Rare Disease at Chiesi, USA.
Thank you. Yash?
Hi, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Yash Jalundwala. I'm a Senior Director in Global Market Access and Pricing at Moderna. I support our efforts in respiratory vaccines.
And finally, Vishwas.
Yes, hi, good day, everyone. Vishwas Garg. I lead dermatology therapeutic area within our value and evidence team at AbbVie. So we do a lot of work in chronic diseases in general.
Thank you. Thank you to our panel for introducing themselves. So we can now dive into our discussion of how to leverage the power of fit-for-purpose data. And we'll start with Patricia, who's going to take us through the challenges in researching and developing treatments for rare diseases, which includes limited patient populations, heterogeneity, and lack of available data. So Patricia, could you take us through kind of your role in the pipeline building as it relates to rare diseases and real-world evidence?
Sure. So Jenna, for rare diseases, so generating this robust clinical evidence, it can be very challenging, right? Due to what you mentioned, the small patient population, it's really actually spread over a diverse geographic area. There is a limited understanding of the progression of many rare diseases. So it's that like either over time and also for different type of populations. There's a lack of a standardization of data and the measures to be collected. So most of the times you're going to see there is a lack from physicians on how they are measuring success of the treatment, what endpoints should be included. And as well, that is going to challenge us in terms of the combining data, comparing how that can shape quality, utility, and the interpretation of the data, as well as data ownership and sharing. So based on the rare disease environment, you're going to see many of the researchers or the physicians, they are centers of excellence where they collect the data, but they are not talking with each other or they're not willing to share with the industry. So this is small patient population, and often this capacity to conduct the traditional clinical, randomized clinical trial give us then the opportunity to use the real world evidence for development of the drug. So the real world data itself can be used in several ways to inform the study design in the drug development for rare disease. It is widely accepted, the applications of RWD, which included the identification of this population, the validation of the clinical endpoint, as well the planning of the inclusion and exclusion criteria, the safety monitoring, we're going to see that as well. And the RWE can also shape use for development of the surrogate biomarkers. So that's how we find those surrogate biomarkers for the clinical trials, which then will help us to shorten the duration of these studies. Most of the time, the clinical trials for rare diseases, they are single-arm trial. So we need to use historical data or real-world data for comparison. Most of the time, there is no natural history data as well. So you have to be very creative on how you're going to use the data that is out there. The agencies really, they ask us for a post-approval safety monitoring because of the trials are very uncertain on that. That small patient population, usually 13, 14 patients on a clinical trial. So we can then leverage the post-market commitment as well for other analysis. We do know that the FDA has provided some guidance now on how to conduct those studies, how to conduct the natural history studies, and then we can actually benefit from those guidances right now for a well-designed study. But it's still, there are some pushbacks on the quality of the data that we are going to use. So for the regulatory purposes, right, to really select the study that we're going to use, there are 4 categories that usually keep in mind. Do we need is it ethical to conduct a study with a placebo control arm? Probably the answer is going to be no. So we use the external control arm. We can use RWE for evidence synthesis. We can look for pragmatic trials and use RWE to fulfill the post-market commitments that we need for FDA, EMA.
Thank you. Yeah, I see you laid out kind of the 4 criteria that you would look for. Could you provide some examples or discuss what would be considered strong real-world evidence that would be appropriate to support NDA or BLA, and that's new drug application or biologic license application submission?
Sure. So the FDA states that the data that we need to use, I think you also mentioned this term, should be fit for purposes, right? So what they are looking for is the reliability and the relevance of the real world data that's critical for making a supporting on the label change or to address a safety concern. So when considering the RWE or RWD, the term reliability includes accuracy, completeness, and traceability of the data. So the FDA, if you look at all the applications that use RWE on the rare disease, let's say non-oncological, all of the other rare disease, the majority of the applications, they are using retrospective real-world data. There's a small proportion that also use both retrospective and prospective data. So what it means having a strong real-world evidence for that. What the FDA is going to look at if you are demonstrating a large effect size, which is despite some of the concerns, criticism that they have, the variances, in the baseline characteristics, the potential of bias, that's actually what they're looking for. The agency also recommend to have a discussion with them on the protocol, on the study design development, and really look for using RWE or RWD to contextualize as well your application. I can give you some examples of how that has been used. So for example, GSK, they use adult data from the real world to actually boost the NDA application of one of their drugs for a pediatric lupus. So GSK conducted what is called a tipping point style analysis to quantify the applicability of the adult to the pediatric study data using real world data.
We have a good question in the chat. So there's a lack of data sharing in rare disease studies. Could you speak to what are the factors involved in this and how can we encourage data sharing in rare disease?
That's a very good question. So the lack of data sharing is basically because although it is a small community, right, there is still some sense of ownership, sense of, let's say, there is still that not willing to share with industry, right? So the industry is using what we can to develop, to generate the evidence, but most of those data owners, they're not working with the industry for multiple reasons. I must say that some of them believe we are evil, but that's how I'll call it. I'm on the other side. But to also overcome to that, there are some examples. So there is an example that used for DMD, Duchenne muscular dystrophy, where this patient group they were able to work with all those researchers across the globe, and they combined their data sources. They were willing to work with the patient group. And the patient advocacy group, we started working a consortium with Pharma as well. So therefore, everybody that uses this data, it has to share and give it back to the community. So that needs to be a purpose for their benefit. So if the advocacy groups and start building those consortiums with pharma, researchers, academic, I think there is a future for data sharing for rare disease. There are instances where ultra rare disease, for example, there's not even a patient group in place. So the academic institutions, they need to start communicate with each other on that sense and work through, let's say, CPATH Institute. They collect all this data and they work with combine those data sources from clinical trials to registries and other examples that we can use.
Great, thank you. And then finally, could you share some examples where RWE is able to predict long-term outcomes when the clinical trials are based on short-term outcomes?
That's a very good question, Jana, and also very tricky because what do you mean in terms of predicting those long-term outcomes in terms of RWE, right? Are we talking about combining RWE with clinical trial data, so doing that link? Where you can use, for example, Bayesian borrowing methodology to increase your sample size and therefore you can work with that amount of data. Or you're talking, we are using RWE to look at long-term outcomes from a registry perspective, or we are talking about prediction analysis. So you can use, again, the data that you have, that very small portion of data, combined with registry data, natural history studies, link those, apply some predictive modeling exercise. It can be, let's say, there are 5 different types of predicting models. My understanding, I'm not a statistician, but we can say there's logistic and regression model that you can look for more shorter outcomes. You can use Cox regression models for intermediate terms outcomes, but you can also look at using dynamic regression models and simulation models for predicting long-term outcomes. Nowadays as well, we know that artificial intelligence and machine learning are techniques that are being increasingly adapted for the use in medical field and research. So there are some examples where they look retrospectively. There are a number of publications out there. They look at studies with retrospective data, apply some machine learning to look for favorable outcomes. What would that look like in 2-3 years for cardiovascular risk, for example? So it's matter of fact, what is actually you are asking for? Are you asking for outcomes based on your drug that you can do some prediction modeling, or are you looking for to predicted outcomes in the natural history data, in the registry data, and then you can select the most appropriate methodology to be applied?
Thank you. So I think it all comes back to this sort of fit for purpose data, right? Which I think will transition nicely to Yash, who can talk about sort of that pre-launch peri-approval period as it relates to vaccines. And to start you off, Yash, just going to pose a question of how do cross-functional teams align on RWE data gaps that need to be filled as part of the evidence generation planning process, accounting for regional needs and differences and other factors?
Yeah, it's a really good question, right? So I think when you think of a peri-launch period, this is the time, let's say 12 to 24 months prior to launch. At a global level, there is a certain advantage of knowing that drugs launch in different countries at different time points. So there may be an advantage to really focus on where you can start collecting real world evidence data for a certain drug once it's launched, because that may still be at a peri-launch period for another country. So I think that kind of coordination of timing and data sources is really important. The second thing comes in terms of a gap. I think it's really important to understand an integrated evidence planning approach where you're looking at all the needs that go beyond the registration to make sure, one, the physicians understand the place of the drug in the care paradigm. The payers are understanding the value that this drug brings in to make sure we have an appropriate access and supports pricing and reimbursement discussions within the countries and their local market access and pricing environments. And thirdly, to ensure that broadly clinical guidelines and societies can really understand how this new medical innovation can be viewed with reference to all the existing innovation that exists, particularly in diseases where multiple lines of therapies or combinations may be possible. So with keeping these three stakeholders in mind, having a comprehensive integrated evidence planning is essential, where you can think of the real world evidence planning from the get-go to not only make sure you support a successful launch, but as soon as the drug is launched, there is appropriate fit for purpose data collection that can be done and scaled up in the right way to have very quick and timely information to the stakeholders to make decisions.
Thank you. And can you share an instance where, an enhanced data linkage or a novel approach to evidence integration significantly impacted a strategic decision at your organization?
Yeah, so I can look at like some of the previous examples, right? So for example, there are certain diseases in the neurosciences space that don't have a very clear objective outcome. And sometimes their impact is a lot more on the patient's quality of life rather than direct healthcare resource utilization approaches. So in those kind of places, it's important to create like meaningful data linkages, not only as we think about the traditional claims data, but think about approaches outside. For example, today we collect a lot of data from wearable sensors. There's a lot of data collected from social media. There's a lot of data collected just outside from contextualization in terms of, particularly when we're thinking the elderly population, right? Like what Medicare beneficiaries contribute in terms of data. So when you create an ecosystem of data from multiple sources to be interconnected and linked in the right way, it helps provide the right contextualization of what does the disease actually mean to the patient, and then what does the treatment do in terms of alleviating the challenges that the symptoms may have brought forward with the disease, or the opportunity to slow down the disease progression itself. And I give this as an example for example, in Alzheimer's disease, right? The new wave of drugs that are coming to slow the disease progression actually are counterintuitive to the basic model of medicine, where you where you think in the basic model that somebody gets sick, you get a medicine, you get better, and that's the whole model. In the new phase of disease modifying drugs, people get sick, people get the drug, they are only getting sick at a slower rate. They are actually not getting better. And this throws the whole traditional model of medicine over its head, right? So again, when we are thinking of how do we contextualize and understand these, like the right data linkages beyond just say a traditional claims or a singular data source like EHR is necessary to truly understand what does the medical innovation mean to the patient.
And kind of reinforcing real world data beyond just claims, can you speak to some of the trade-offs of various data sources? So when is data recency, for example, more important versus data cleanliness?
Yeah, so it's a good question. I'll bring in maybe an example from my recent experiences in the vaccines world. So typically within the vaccines world, immunogenicity is an acceptable kind of a data point to approve new variants or vaccines effectiveness per se. And that's just basically saying as immunogenicity that a vaccine generates enough immune response within the patients themselves, right? And that biological immune response would potentially have a clinical desired effect at a later stage. However, until let's just say seasonal vaccines like flu or more recently COVID and more adult respiratory vaccines that are coming out, until the vaccines are actually administered, it's hard to know what the real world evidence around it is in terms of reducing death, hospitalization, or other such metrics. So in cases like these, where time is of the essence, recency of the data more important than cleanliness. Also, I think it makes a difference in terms of what your outcome is. Is it more of counts of events happening versus accuracy of the medication or the cost that was actually used up or not? So I think there are like to these kind of more, as you think of real world evidence generation within the time period to quickly happen versus something that's more historically to address the need. Another example, I think, is this phase of outcomes-based contract or risk-sharing agreements that's kind of been around a lot, but very hard to administer and actually make a reality. In some of those, again, the more quicker the data comes could have a trade-off in terms of the cleanliness of the data and how much it kind of lags, particularly if decision-making on stopping a treatment or initiating a treatment need to happen based on some of this information. So I think we need to always keep that trade-off in mind in terms of how clean we want the data and what's the data going to be used for in terms of decision-making, and always accept a certain amount of risk and not go for perfect data to lose a lot of time onto it, right? When it particularly links to real clinical decision-making versus, I think the other context is a lot more cleaner data to just understand the burden of the disease or really understand the space of a new innovation in the treatment paradigm.
Thank you, Yash. So I want to give Vishwas now a chance to talk about the post-launch period and as it relates to chronic disease. And Vishwas, if you could talk about start us off by the role of real-world evidence. It's evolved to support the maximization of the asset potential beyond just the traditional channels of payers.
Yeah, absolutely. So if we think about what Patricia and Yash talked about so far, we have covered the role real-world evidence can play in pipeline, and then the role real-world evidence can play towards launch. Right? Those two milestones in an asset lifecycle are well defined. For pipeline, you ought to get regulatory approval. You got to get payer access approvals and all of that for you to be able to bring the drug on the market. Together, basically, those are the two big challenges of those two buckets. But what is it in post-marketing stage that we are working towards, right? Drug is already out, access is already there. So why do we still need evidence? Why do we specifically need real-world evidence? I think that's where this question that you just asked is so important for us to think about. In chronic diseases, from where I come, we generally don't have shortage of data in pipeline and launch. Even after post-launch, I think of ourselves as very lucky that we generally have access to rich, high-quality data, not from just US, but from other countries as well. So we are very fortunate that way. But I think if I think back to the question you asked, which is about how do we really maximize the potential of a pharmaceutical product, in order for us to do that, the end decision maker must understand the value of that pharmaceutical product. And today, when I think about how we generally go about doing that, we are very good at defining that value. We can come up with exceptionally well-designed studies. We can come up with, accelerated timelines and the best idea ever. But where things get really stuck are, okay, once you have the data available, is it really being used by your sales teams, by your medical teams, by some other non-traditional groups beyond payers, that have been consumers of RWE and RWD for many years to come, right? And have been in the past as well. So really, I think I want to focus on those two areas of evolution to your question, Jana, which is for commercial audience and for prescriber audience, how is the role of real world evidence evolving? Specifically today, because it's a very big topic, I want to talk about United States, and I want to focus on this new guidance that came out from FDA in 2018. It's called Consistent with FDA Labeling Requirement Guidance. So real quick, most of you must have heard of CFL guidance or what I just said, right? But what is it, right? And why is it important? It's important because until that guidance came out, it was a generally acceptable standard that for manufacturers to promote on, on a message, one controlled study is required, at least, and that has been best practice for a long time. These are my personal opinions, my opinions only, not the opinions of AbbVie. But in my personal opinion, when I read that CFL guidance, it has enabled a lot more opportunities for us to evolve the role RWE can play in that final decision that a healthcare provider can make for a patient about any given pharmaceutical asset. Currently, there is a lack of understanding, generally speaking, about what is that role of RWE. Does RWE even have a role or not? The way CFL guidance is stated is the evidentiary support should be scientifically appropriate and statistically sound. But scientifically appropriate and statistically sound is not really defined anywhere. So, generally speaking, people have a really good understanding of what is clinical trial evidence in context of SaaS, but people generally don't have a good sense of how to think about RWE in terms of SaaS. And mastering the data confidence, which is our topic today, that is just not optimized, today. And I think this is where innovative data solutions, where we have more depth of data, more cleanliness of data, higher quality of data in general. It is critical for us to have more of those solutions, because then we can create higher and higher quality evidence, which can then be scientifically appropriate and statistically sound. And then the evidence from that study can be used as evidentiary support for promotional communication of medical products. There is a lot of specifics in there that we need to think about together. But one thing to always consider about quality of any study is quality of data is absolutely critical for a study to be of high quality in the end. Whether you can get that quality of data through a well-controlled randomized study, or you should be able to get a rich real-world source of data, which meets some of the requirements that even Patricia was talking about. For instance, in her introduction. So the more we can do that, the more confidence we can master when it comes to using RWE studies in their evolving kind of paradigm for prescriber and commercial use in general.
Great, thank you. And so you touched upon this somewhat in your answer, but so what would constitute that fit for purpose real world evidence for post-launch maximization of that asset potential?
That's a really good question to ask. I would start by saying that it's not defined anywhere today, but I think it is somewhat different than how we have thought historically about what is fit for purpose for regulatory approvals. Some facts to know. First fact is that the FDA has stated that once a drug has met the approval standards, that means that the safety and efficacy of the drugs has been established. and therefore post-approval, for you to communicate the value of a drug, the same standards for evidence are not required. It is in the CFL guidance itself. FDA also says that, the type and quantity of evidence will vary by the type of message, promotional communication. The FDA also says that in general, a variety of sources of data are valuable, for such type of information. So those are just regulatory facts, in my personal opinion. Now, I think to then think about your question about what is fit for purpose, I think we have to make sure that we can adopt, as much as transparency, as much as scientific rigor, as much as our data quality standards. There is no threshold defined anywhere, and it's really about, say, if I want to make a comparative claim, that's a much higher standard in my personal opinion than if you just want to say number one used product. For that, like something is like less kind of critical is probably okay, right? So I think for us as outcomes researchers, we are probably on the right side of the curve, where we have to be ahead of the curve and make sure that we set the standards, by making sure our research is of the highest quality and grade, because only then we can all adopt good practices together. From there, I think, some of the external benchmarks that we can think about is for good practices. For instance, even some of the RWD and RWE regulatory guidance for industries that have been rolled out by the FDA, and some other commonly acceptable standards that might be available. Sometimes there is publicly used RWE information on pharmaceutical products websites. So looking at like what's out there, what's generally kind of an acceptable standard, that others are doing, that might be a benchmark to think about as well. So different ways of thinking about fit for purpose, but ultimately I think the stronger our start, the better is the likelihood of success. So the higher quality data we use, the more rich source of data we use, the more successful we will be in the end, to making sure that the evidence produced from the data are scientifically appropriate and statistically sound.
Thank you, Vishwas. So what are the panelists' thoughts and kind of your experience with tokenization and bespoke linkages, maybe specifically as it relates to rare diseases or where you're working with small sample size? And I'll open this up to any of the panelists to answer. Patricia, I'm having trouble hearing you.
May I kick us off with
Go
an
ahead.
experience on tokenization in general, and Patricia can figure out technical issues in the meantime. So I think in general, tokenization is an evolving technology, and we are just starting to understand its use cases. And its applications would vary by type of disease, type of question, and all of that. I think it's an exciting opportunity for us to think about, what Yash was describing, building an ecosystem of the data. A lot of the times, we have to really kind of think about how do we optimize our investments over the long term, and investing tokenization in early on, when a drug is in pipeline, can make sure that once the drug is approved, the investments we will have to make for expensive phase 4 studies can actually be minimized, because then you will have a richer ecosystem of data. You can start to link your trial patients with claims, with EHRs, with registries, as much as possible, wherever you have that token available. So making sure we can kind of adopt practices that would allow us to start doing that as early as possible will then make for like a lot of rich use cases for RWE-based evidence strategy post-launch from a chronic disease experience perspective.
Thank you, Vishwas.
Can you hear me now, Jenna?
Yes, all good now.
Okay, excellent. I just thank you, Vin, for your That's exactly what I was going to mention. From a rare disease perspective, when we use the tokens, right, it's basically because we want to try to link the data. So, for example, in the US, when you tokenize the clinical trial data, you can link with claims database for the same patient. That's something that's being widely used in the US right now. There's not much. I don't have any actual example on how we can do this in Europe, but we'll be expanding for sure very soon. For a rare disease, it's basically how we can really link all of those data using tokens. It does make our analysis more robust.
If I can add to that, I think, I look at it in two ways. So one is we should always start with the why. Why are we tokenizing? Why are we linking? And what do we hope to get out of it? And that will influence in terms of understanding what data sets even need to be linked versus what all is available, and let's link them and then, out of curiosity, build more things ahead, right? So I'll use this as two examples. So one is like, claims, we may be able to understand if a patient had some labs ordered, but we don't know what the lab values are. So you want to then tokenize and link it to a database that actually gives you the lab value for that patient, to say it's a high lab value, low lab value. But then both of this, you still don't know why the lab was ordered to begin with. And that's why tokenizing and linking it to an EHR helps create a closed loop in terms of what was the doctor thinking to order the lab, what did the doctor do based on seeing the lab value, and now you know the whole part, right? But again, so this just shows that each of the three data sets standalone are important and can be sufficient to answering the question. But if your question really requires more than one, then that's where the benefit of tokenization can help you accurately answer the question versus triangulating based on, I see this here and I see this here, and as an aggregate, I'm going to answer something. The other part, I think, Patricia touched upon, like the US. Unfortunately, sometimes when we think about clinical trials and its linkages, US does end up having a certain advantage because most clinical trials have largest number of patients from US. Outside the US, we tend to think about regions, but it is country-specific regulations and data linkage policies, which sometimes mean that the sample sizes may just not be conducive enough to have a meaningful scientific inquiry. So that's why I think, US kind of sometimes disproportionately gets a much heavier focus onto it. And so when we're thinking of clinical trials and AI, I think the field of neurosciences also has advanced a lot with this concept of digital twins. That's again, building onto this element of data linkages and creating almost ways in which trials can be accelerated, as Patricia was saying, not just in the rare disease space, but also other diseases where typically to see a treatment effect, you may have to do a trial for 2 years or 3 years or 5 years. And ethically to keep somebody blinded and on placebo for that long may just not be feasible. So as we're thinking of the next wave of innovation of drugs that could come and what kind of trial durations it will require to show the treatment benefit, even in the chronic diseases side, outside the rare, I think these data linkages offer an opportunity to truly maximize our scientific innovation.
Thank you. Do you find generally that US payers are becoming more tolerant of global real-world evidence when it comes to supportive coverage?
Maybe I can say, in my personal opinion, it's actually the other way around. Like US is much more data rich, and with all the vertical integration and consolidation that's happened over the years, most of the major payers now have their own good in-house data capability and understanding and a lot of sample size. So, I think the trend everywhere in general for payers is to see local data. It doesn't matter where it comes from, because that's much easier for them to make bigger decisions on. In US in particular, given the richness of the data environment and some consolidation that's happened, they're even more attuned to understanding US problems from US data point of view. And that's particularly true when payers are thinking of cost. For example, the cost of a hospitalization in US would be very different than it is in another country. And so even within the United States, if you have a payer that has a much more regional focus with more and more access to data, their desire is to understand what fits well for their region and purpose rather than understanding globally, particularly when it comes to something like cost, right? I think in clinical effectiveness, they understand that may not have a geographic variation. So as Vishwas was mentioning, these elements of comparative effectiveness and understanding which drug is better than the other, There may be some more openness to still consider pooled analysis, data from outside the US to still have the same element of understanding robustness and adding more sample size and generalizability.
Great, thank you.
I agree with you, Yash. I think the main question, it was sort of data, right, that we are talking about that they are willing to accept. If you look at, for example, in terms of recommendations and how ICER is using data, they are not, obviously they are considered only cost data from the US. But then when it comes to the payer decision, if it's something that was developed by NICE, right, the model and or evidence that came from there, they're going to use as they see fit, if that's going to benefit them. So there is some flexibility in that sense. So it depends on the data that is the question is asking me. Is that cost data? No, the answer is healthcare resource utilization. The answer, no, it's very localized data. It is clinical data for rare disease, yes, because the data is very scarce. So it is effectiveness from a cost effectiveness analysis, then they would use what is going to benefit them.
Great, thank you. So let's talk about leveraging real-world evidence for physicians and patients in terms of it, allows us to provide real-time feedback, identify gaps in care. And I love this question that we can use real-world evidence to, convince providers to treat or prescribe and start patients on therapy. But how do you use real-world evidence to convince patients to stay on therapy, with adherence being a big issue all around?
I think that's where the role of raising quality of care in general comes into the play. It's not that once a patient is prescribed a drug, he or she does not have touch points with healthcare system anymore. I think there are constant opportunities to have touch points, both through the prescriber as well as through some of the patient support programs, for instance, that are generally available for some of the specialty medicines, at least nowadays. And I think through tools like those, patients do find value. There are actually research publications on that, right, that show that patients who are enrolled in a patient support program generally would have high adherence, persistence, even lower discontinuation rates. All of those type of research activities, by the way, do require high quality real world data, that is produced, from which evidence is produced by, healthcare functions like ours, right? So I think this is again an area for us to think about fit for purpose data use. What does that mean? What do you really need there and all of that? But, I think those tools are an example of a way to improve adherence, and RWE has a role to play in there that we show as a proof point that adherence was positively impacted. That's how I think. So sometimes we overemphasize the importance of RWE as well, and this is coming from someone who loves to talk about this topic. But RWE and RWD are just intermediary steps into something bigger. They are a tool available to us versus like something final that we are striving towards, right? Why do we produce RWE and RWD? It's not because we want to produce RWD and RWE, but it is because we want to inform a critical healthcare decision through the evidence that is produced here to make sure that that decision is evidence-based. Ultimately, that's how we kind of leverage RCTs, RWDs, or any other types of research tools that might be available, right? So I think about this problem in terms of how can you apply RWE and RWD as tools to then be able to provide proof points for valuable offering, to a patient that can then lead to improvement in adherence and persistence. Obviously, there are other possibilities like, hey, you can have a technology like a new app, right? Which kind of helps you monitor your adherence more. And in a way, you're collecting RWD, probably can kind of do RWE using real-time analytics to show a patient how much more meaningful. Even an Apple Watch is a good example of that in some ways, right? So there are a lot of different ways. But again, from a perspective of outcomes research, thinking about this question more as how do we apply these tools towards a bigger goal, so that like the final healthcare decision is impacted and is made evidence-based, that is really maybe a good way to think about this.
Jan, if I can add on to what Vishwas was saying, right? I think this is where, because of the advances we've made in collection of data, scaling it, cleaning it, analyzing, visualizing, right? And now more generative AI or machine learning approaches, like being able to take this to a much more futuristic state, which is much more advanced, right? I think the application can go even beyond at a personalized patient level, right? So you're talking of like health behaviors and behavior as adherence. So if you think about the future of a healthcare system, say, at every time that you visit a doctor, particularly with chronic medications where you may have like regular visits, there's systematic data collected at every time point. Once you give enough time of maturity, the kind of dashboards that could allow doctors to see how the patient is doing, or the patients themselves to see how they are doing. And we, as humans, we think we are all a little bit kind of competitive in there to say, how are you doing compared to an average trend, and how are you using adherence as a basis to ensure optimal health outcomes, or at the right point, ensuring that a timely switch of medication happens for the right medical reason to now make sure the outcomes are more optimal, right? So I think with more person-generated health data playing a role in real-world evidence, the more dashboard approaches and interlinking of a patient view and a healthcare provider's view, and with predictive models, I think applying that opportunity to know upfront when and where should somebody intervene to ensure non-adherence doesn't happen, right? And that kind of identifying that at-risk groups and at-risk behaviors. I think those nudges that real-world data can help us have a lot more applicability in the future than it has probably in the last even 5 or 10 years or so.
Great, thank you. A couple of questions from the chat that we haven't touched upon. If we could comment more on data quality and advocating for any actual data cleaning or using reliable sources of data.
I think that we need to evaluate on the context, right, of the intended use of the data. It cannot be assessed looking at the data and in isolation. So I would say to evaluate the quality of the data, we need to consider whether any is an individual data, is a combined data source, what is the information that we want from the data to answer a given like research question. So the specific data quality issue that come in my mind is when we attempted to create and integrate various data sources. For example, I mentioned about the rare disease case, which is going to be including, we are going to have missing data, a lack of core common data elements that you don't often see in the rare disease. There is incomplete data dictionaries, there's a lack of longitudinal data, and a lack of validated questionnaires. So most of these issues, they are not just for rare disease, right? It's not only data ecosystem for rare disease, but it's also, it's a common issue. So my colleagues here on this panel, they can mention on this. So the issues in the quality is in completeness and relevance of the data source. They are really they were going to lead us to uncertainties. So it's really, to me, is what the data is going to be used for. Obviously, you want to really look at the data that's going to give you the most accurate information with less uncertainty. So do we just need to clean the data, curate the data? Is really going to be the question that we're trying to answer. So basically, there is also a Sentinel initiative from the FDA. If you look at that, they are developing detailed recommendations on the standard-based approach to describing data, present the data quality metrics. So there are some efforts to address these limitations, right, on the quality of the data.
Great, thank you. I'm going to continue with the Q&A here. Real-world data can be very diverse. There are limitations, based on just claims data alone. So could you speak to prospective data collection, that's non-interventional observational data, as well as data from patient support programs, and how you might integrate that?
Yeah, I can kick us off. So I think two separate sub-questions under there. One is more generally about prospective ways of data collection, and second one is what role patient support programs have in that. I think both probably have common strengths and limitations when we compare them to retrospective data that is available for us. And I think it's important for us to think about what is the question that is of interest for which we want to have some data available. So always start with the end in mind, and then you will, in my personal experience, most of the times get to an answer that a lot of retrospective data that are available to us, at least from a post-marketing perspective, is highly suitable to meet our business needs. Sometimes even prospectively collected data are available retrospectively. For instance, even this EHR system, the way it is built is that there is opportunity to have more deeper insights available over a longer period of time that allows for higher richness of the data in general. So some of the use cases for prospective data collection are more and more limited in that way, but there are certainly chances when we want to have prospective. For instance, when a certain outcome measure is not available, like sometimes a common observation I have is in chronic diseases, clinical outcomes data is less available in these retrospective data sets. So those type of questions require prospective data collection. I think in those cases, thinking about factors like how much time I have, what sample size I need, and how much investments I could make are good ways to think about doing a prospective study overall versus like a subgroup of that, which is relying on your patient support program base of patients to then be able to do some of the same work. Nowadays, it is possible more and more to be able to have scientific outreach to patients who are enrolled in a specific patient support program, and then use them as kind of a base for you to be able to do a lot of what you wanted to do through a independent prospective observational study. And this new approach has many positives like lower cost, faster time, and sometimes even like easier ability to reach out because in some disease areas it's very hard to enroll patients, and here you already have a group of users, right? There are also some downsides, like generally it's harder to get a true baseline because patients are already there, right? So there is possibility of recall bias, all of those technical issues, right? We have to analyze as experts in this area, but there are a lot of possibilities to answer the original question, to do research prospectively in an innovative way. And then even thinking about how do we link some of that data? Is there a way to tokenize patients at the time and then linking them back to another data set like a claim or an EHR system could even allow for a more ecosystem of data model that you can build through that way. A downside would be you will not have comparatives generally, because patient support program only has one set of drug versus like everyone in that disease area. But those are the trade-offs that we can make together.
Great, thank you. Another question just came through the chat. What do you think about data collected from products used as compound formulations, but used for long periods of time, over 10 years, in thousands of patients? How can this become useful for regulatory purposes?
This is a very good question. I actually have not seen any I'm going to say from the FDA on agreement on using the type of data coming from compounding pharmacy. To me, is like, how is this data being collected, right? How can you track that and who is using it? It's not, to me, I have not seen any submission using compounding data, even if it's 10 years, 2 years, or 1 year. It's a very good question.
Yeah, thanks, Patricia. So we talked about kind of data sharing, but how do we ensure seamless sharing of evidence gaps and the real world findings within the same organization, but different organizational levels, whether it's global, regional, or local affiliates?
I think maybe I can get a start at it. So I think doesn't matter what the size of the organization, data sharing and information is always very complex. It's always a challenge. And so I think the only way you get to it is you work as a team and you make sure people trust each other and don't use information as a currency that people are holding on to. It's much more widely shared, right? So I don't think that the size of organization challenges is just people work in different time zones, people work with different kind of focuses, like, there's a local focus, there's a global focus, there's different priorities. And so that becomes a challenge. However, saying that, I think good practices in integrated evidence planning can help overcome some of these challenges itself. So having a set calendar of when there is a global to local and local to global kind of information sharing helps in creating some predictability. Having appropriate information for not just planning of evidence, but even dissemination of evidence once it's generated in the right way helps ensure that these silos get broken. And there is this true opportunity of understanding where even any local data, so as manufacturers, right, sometimes we have a lot of insights on what we are generating and what we are spending our resources on, but there's also the world outside once the product is launched that's also working on our products and doing research in it, right? So ensuring that right kind of sharing of information helps make sure we are not repeating something that's already there. It helps make sure that we can leverage every bit of information and evidence on a medical innovation to make sure the most people get access to the innovation, because the innovation is only as good as the number of people who are going to get it, right? If they don't get it for any reason, then I think we've all collectively failed in our approach to alleviate the medical symptoms. So I think better planning, a better communication, and having a worldview that's both internal and external helps probably bridge some of these gaps of, where are the gaps, who's filling it, and how do we make sure we can, in an agile and efficient way, get access faster to the patients.
Thank you, Yash. And I love what you said about not using information as currency. So important. Well, with about 5 minutes left, I hope everyone's found this session meaningful. I'd like to thank our panelists for being here. And I'd like them to provide one key takeaway from today's discussion to sort of wrap up. We've talked about a lot of different things, but so we can start with Patricia.
Sure. Thank you, Jenna. Thank you, everyone, and thank you for the invite for this panel. For me, the takeaway is there's so much data out there. We need to be working together. Either we are all in different industries, pharmaceutical industry, researcher, academics, to benefit the patient, and always keeping that in mind. So my takeaway, there's so much data there. There's so many new methodologies to use this data to benefit the patient. So in my ask to the panel and to everyone listening here today is let's be more collaborative. In the rare disease space, we do need that. So there are basically almost nothing there for those patients. So we work towards to benefit them.
Thank you, Patricia. Yash?
Yeah, I think I'll add to what Patricia is saying, right? Echoing what she was saying. I think, real world is messy, real world is dynamic, and there's never just one prism to look at it, because there's many different truths that exist in the real world. So I think as long as we keep these three things in mind and we keep things fit for purpose and we work in a collaborative way, we can truly leverage real world data to create the right kind of evidence, to inform the right kind of decisions that need to be made, while knowing that not everything is going to be perfect, and that's okay, because it's going to continue being messy, dynamic, and many viewpoints will still hold true in the same way.
Thank you, Yash. And Vishwas?
So what I would say is go back to the first question you asked me about how do we maximize the potential of an asset and what role RWE has to play in that. I would say that role is evolving as we talked about today. 5-10 years from today, real world evidence will have much bigger role post-marketing in terms of communicating the product value, especially in United States through CFL. And there the conversation about what fit for purpose data and what fit for purpose analytics are critical conversations to have. It is up to us to be able to have a purpose very clearly defined for the team. Making sure that both we follow highest possible research standards, but at the same time, we don't apply the regulatory approval mindset to those conversations because the drug is already approved. Post-approval drug communications, the federal courts have stated that that is a First Amendment issue, freedom of speech issue. It's not a FD&C Act issue. So the evidentiary support should be scientifically appropriate and statistically sound, not substantial evidence. Those are the two completely different things for us to be aware of, and making sure we, as experts, continue to push those forward so that we can optimize the use of real-world evidence in healthcare decision-making. At the end of the day, that's all what we are doing here is most important key takeaway from this conversation for me.
Thank you, Vishwas. Thank you again to the panelists for being here and sharing their really valuable insights. I hope you found this meaningful. Thank you.